First of all, I appreciate everyone being here. Like Matthew said, my name's Jonathan Kaplan. I'm the founder and managing partner of Numeris Capital, an Austin, Texas-based Bitcoin and crypto asset investment fund. And today I'm going to be talking about the history of money. It's going to be difficult to try to cover 50,000 years of financial history in about half an hour, so I do want to mention first that I'll be available afterwards if anybody wants to ask questions outside of the auditorium. And second, that this entire presentation is based on a thesis that I wrote for my fund, which is located on my website, numeris.capital. So if you want to dig a bit deeper into any of these ideas, the article is only about a 10-minute read, but it is chock filled with all the hyperlinks of the research that I've done, books I've read, blogs, articles, podcasts, all that. So feel free to check that out. And if anyone is interested about Numeris and the investment service I provide, please feel free to shoot me an email. Now, in order to talk about money, we really have to talk about human history, because I think the most common question that I get from my clients or prospects that are interested in Bitcoin is, how can something be considered the greatest store of value that humanity's ever seen if the price can one day be $20,000 and then $3,000 the next day? And it's a good question. And those are actually two entirely different concepts, an exchange rate or a price and value storage. And in order to disentangle those, we, again, have to look at how human history has evolved and how the technologies that we use to store and transmit value over time have evolved as well. Because that's really what money is, a technology invented by humans that solves some very important problems with trade and commerce and allows us to store and transmit value through time and space. So when we're looking at the big picture here, this is the timeline of everything. Universe is 4.5 billion years old, life is 3 billion years old, and then way, like a speck away from the present day, roughly anatomically modern humans emerge about 4 million years ago, or at least the greater apes start to evolve. And if we zoom in a bit further, just to the human timeline, we see that the modern day technology, industry, even agriculture is really an evolutionarily recent phenomenon. And that what we're going to find is that money is actually far, far older than most people think it is. And so, again, we need to take into account that what we see around us every day, civilization itself, is really not that old. It's a blink of an eye in evolutionary time spans. But if we look back to what we've seen throughout history, again, we had Homo sapiens sapiens hunting and gathering on the African savanna maybe about 40 to 50,000 years ago, and that was the norm, evolutionarily speaking, for humans. And it wasn't until maybe 12,000 years ago that we discover agriculture, and then relatively briefly after that, industry and technology. And so in trying to talk about how money has evolved, we want to talk about how money might have come about in the first place. And that's difficult to do because money is actually older than writing and thus older than recorded history. And we know that because the oldest example of writing we've ever found is what you're looking at right here. It's an ancient Sumerian tablet, about 6,000 years old, and it's essentially a very heavy spreadsheet. It was used by the Sumerian state for tax collection purposes, keeping track of who owned how many heads of cattle, bushels of grain, that sort of thing. And so what we find is that by the time civilization was properly established, money was already an integral part of society. But because money is older than writing, we don't know exactly how it came about. And the best that we can do is take a look at the current hunter-gatherer tribes spread out around the world that exist in very much a similar state to how humans might have existed, say, 50,000 years ago. And so when we look at these indigenous tribes in, say, the Amazonian basin, sub-Saharan Africa, the Australian outback, we find that in every area we look, they use a specific type of primitive money. They've all come up with the same idea, but they use disparate items such as shark's teeth or bird's feathers or colorful beads or stones. And so in order to figure out, well, first of all, how could all of these tribes have come up with the same idea? And then second of all, how can they take that same idea and use things as different as bird's teeth or bird's feathers or shark's teeth or colorful beads or rhinestones or, of course, nowadays we have paper and digital currencies. Well, in order to answer that question, what I want to do is imagine what it must have been like to have been alive 50,000 years ago. And your life was probably pretty similar to what you see in this picture here. You probably lived in a tribe of 50 to 150 people, and every day, 100% of your time was likely spent simply trying to survive. Well, what do you need in order to survive? The basics. Food, water, shelter, clothing, tools, weapons would be nice. And in order to acquire those things, you've got two choices. You can either acquire them all yourself, you can hunt your own food, you can fetch your own water, you can sew your own clothing, build your own tools, or you can pick whatever you happen to be best at, you can specialize, you can create a surplus, and then you can trade with other people that are doing the same. And the economists in the room are thinking of Ricardo and his theory of comparative advantage, and that's exactly what it is. It turns out that because we're all biologically unique, we're going to be better at some things than others. And that if instead of trying to be a jack of all trades, we specialize in something, we're going to very quickly get better at something, ideally that we already have natural talent for, and then we can create a surplus. And if everyone else does that, we can trade and we all benefit. The great thing about trade is that it's a non-zero-sum game. When you and I both trade with each other, we both become better off and the total wealth of society increases. Now, that's all well and good. It helps us, certainly, but with bartering, the system of trading goods or commodities, services that I just described, there are a handful of problems. So I'm going to run over those very briefly. The double coincidence of wants, the pricing problem, and storing value. Now, the double coincidence of wants is basically exactly what it sounds like. In order for a trade to take place, I have to have what you want at the same time that you want what I have. And if we don't have that double coincidence, we're not going to make a trade. Now, assuming that we both have what the other wants at the same time, the next problem we run into is pricing. If you have to price every good or service in the economy in terms of every other good or service, you might be able to do that if there's 5 of y'all, but if there's 500 or 5,000 or 5 million people, well, it quickly becomes untenable. And now, even if you solve the double coincidence and the pricing problem, which you're not, but assuming that you did, you'd still run into possibly an even more important problem, which is storing value. When you think about how that value might have been created 50,000 years ago in terms of gathering food or creating clothing or whatever it might be, if you didn't have a way to store that value, then you weren't going to be able to create much wealth or keep the wealth that you do create. If you're a farmer and you store your wealth in grain and you wake up one day to find that your granary is filled with mold, there goes all your value. And if you're a hunter and you bag an antelope one day, but even after eating your fill, you don't find a way to cure or store that meat, and you wake up the next day to see that it's filled with maggots, well, there goes all your value. And so what happened is, and this takes a little bit of imagination, but what might have happened is that humans realized that they could solve these problems by playing a game, the game of money. And this might have happened by, say, one day a hunter goes out and brings back a catch, and his fellow hunter goes out, comes back empty-handed. And just as an example, maybe the hungry guy says, you know, look, buddy, you've got that nice juicy antelope, I'm starving, why don't you do me a favor and give me some of your meat? And, tell you what, I'm going to owe you. But just in case you don't trust me to remember that, or, in case you want something to make sure that the debt that I'm going to owe you is recognized, well, you see that shiny rock over there? I'm going to pick up this rock and I'm going to use it to represent the value that you've given me in helping me to have dinner tonight. And at some point in the future, when there's value that I have that you want, you can come back to me and you can take that shiny pebble and you can redeem that debt that we've created. And when you play a game like this, all sorts of possibilities start to open up, because now not only have we externally encapsulated that idea of value as opposed to just two people remembering it in their minds, well now, let's say that I owe my buddy, but he owes somebody else. Well now, he can take that pebble and he can say, look, I know I owe you, but Jonathan owes me. And so this instrument that represents that value, I'm going to give it to you, and now Jonathan owes you. And what we find is that as humans played that game for thousands of years, and they compared different iterations of that game with each other as they conducted trades with various tribes and civilizations, we find that the better the object you pick to play that game conforms to specific objective ideals, the monetary ideals, the better that game plays for everyone. If money is divisible and fungible and durable and portable and acceptable and uniform and most importantly scarce, Well, the better the money that you pick conforms to those ideals, the better the game's going to be. And like we talked about with trade and commerce, it's a non-zero-sum game. If you can find a money that stores value over time and space better than a previous one, everyone playing it is going to benefit from that upgrade. And so what we found is that over thousands of years, as the various human civilizations played that money game and compared their rules, they all settled on one particular object that better conformed to the monetary ideals than anything else. And that money was gold. Gold is divisible, it's fungible, it's durable, it's portable, it's acceptable, it's uniform, and most importantly, you can't make more of it. Now, you can dig more of it up out of the ground. You can maybe filter it from the oceans. Elon wants to mine it from asteroids. We'll see. But most importantly, you can't just create more gold. Now, there are a few downsides to gold. It's very dense. It's very heavy. It's quite malleable. It's easy for bits of it to rub off. And so I imagine that one day somebody came up with a good idea and they said, look, instead of carrying your life savings in this big heavy sack around with you as you go about your errands every day, well, tell you what, I'm going to start a business called a bank. And what I'm going to do is, for a very small fee, you can store your gold with me. I'll protect it. I'll manage it. And I'm going to give you a piece of paper that represents the gold that you gave me. And so now when you run your errands, you can just, give these little pieces of paper to the baker and the butcher and the cobbler, and it'll be more convenient for everyone. And then whenever they want, they can come to me and they can redeem those pieces of paper, and I'll give them the gold that it represents. And that's the most important part, that these little IOUs, they're not intrinsically valuable. They represent the value that was gold. Now, this is a great system until the person running the bank decides that he's going to create more IOUs than he actually has value in the bank. And that's what inflation is. And this is probably going to be the part of the presentation where I lose half the audience, because we've been told our entire lives by our teachers and our professors and our government and all the big famous economists in the world that inflation is a good thing. And that if we don't constantly inflate the money supply, people will stop spending money at all and the economy will grind to a halt and the universe will explode. I disagree. And so, again, I think this is the crux of the issue, is that a lot of people don't really understand how inflation works. Well, the way that it works is that when you trade value, whether it's an existing object, your time, your energy, when you trade for a monetary object like gold, what you're doing is you're trading value for other value that's part of a system. And let's use the example of gold. Let's say that you decide to trade 1 month's labor for an ounce of gold. Well, at that point, year zero, you have 1 ounce out of, I have no idea how many ounces of gold there are in the world, so don't fact check me on this, but just for the sake of argumentation, let's say that it's 100 million ounces. Well, on year zero, you have 1 ounce out of 100 million. But then as we continue digging gold out of the ground and filtering it from the oceans, et cetera, it turns out, if you do the math over the last couple hundred years, gold is actually slightly inflationary to about 1%. So as we discover more gold and the supply increases, year zero at the time of the trade, you've got 1 out of 100 million. But then next year, you've got 1 out of 101 million. And then out of 102 million, and then out of 103 million. And even though the amount that you have is static, that 1 ounce of gold is still 1 ounce of gold, the percentage of the gold network that you own slowly decreases. And that's what inflation is. If you had $20 in the bank in 1998, it might have bought you a certain amount of goods and services. But that same $20 in 2005 would not buy you nearly the same, and so on and so forth. There's a reason that your grandparents could buy a can of Coke for a nickel, and if I go out into the hallway right here and I try to buy a can of Coke from the vending machine, it's going to be $1.50. And it's not like sugar, water, and aluminum got any more expensive. If anything, the Coca-Cola company has grown and engaged its economies of scale and switched out sugar for high fructose corn syrup, and it should be cheaper than ever to produce a can of sugar water. But it costs more because your money has dramatically lost its purchasing power. And lest you think that I'm picking on the dollar, this has been going on for thousands of years. Currency debasement is nothing new. Ancient emperors used to collect coins during their tax runs every year, and they would clip them. They would shave off the edges, and they would use those trimmings to then melt them back into new coins. And so if you look at a modern quarter or nickel or some of the harder currencies, you'll notice that the edges often have little ridges or engravings, and that's so that you know that you don't get the coin on the right which has been shaved to the point where it's obviously much smaller. Now, this has only accelerated since the rise of central banking, the United States adoption of the Federal Reserve, and in particular, when President Richard Nixon suspended the gold exchange system and essentially made the US dollar a purely fiat currency. I find it fascinating that if I go into my basement and I start printing $100 bills, the government calls it counterfeiting, and it's a felony, and I could go to jail for 20 years or more. But when the government does it, they call it quantitative easing, and they insist that it's necessary and crucial and it's a good thing, and you should just mind your own business and let the smarter people run the world economy, because that's worked out so well over the last century, trusting our governments to manage our currency supply. It turns out, seriously, that every time you've allowed a government to control your currency, you've made a huge mistake. And we can see that visually through a couple of examples here. The top left is Weimar Germany, after the Allies forced the country to pay massive amounts of reparation for World War I. The money became worth so little that they had to resort to weighing it at the store rather than counting it. Children were using it to play Lego blocks of gigantic Deutschmarks. And we see the same thing in modern Zimbabwe. If you want to buy a loaf of bread from the market, you've got to take a wheelbarrow filled with money. It's just amazing. And of course, this is what we're seeing here in the United States. In 2008, we had the big banks make a bunch of terrible decisions, loan out a bunch of money that they couldn't make back, and instead of going bankrupt and clearing the way for good businesses to emerge that don't lose massive amounts of money, well, the banks convinced our politicians to just turn on the printing presses, and we have dramatically increased the amount of dollars in circulation ever since then. Now, at that time, 2008, 2009, plenty of people were paying attention to this, and they realized that the economic game that they were playing was rigged. There's nothing they can do about it. You know that the game is rigged. You know that the house is always going to win and you're always going to lose. Well, what are you going to do? It's the only game in town. Or should I say, it was the only game in town until a group of Austrian economists, computer programmers, anarcho-capitalists, cypherpunks decided that they were going to create a new game, a game based on the open source ethos and transparency of the internet, a game that fixed the rigged problems of the current game and allowed people to opt out of a corrupt financial system into a brand new one. And they called that system Bitcoin. Now, given that I've got about 10 minutes left, the technical scope of Bitcoin and how a blockchain works and private key cryptography, it's a little bit more than I can cover right now. I hope the next person talking about Bitcoin might delve a bit deeper into that. So suffice it to say, I'm going to keep it at a high level and just describe Bitcoin as a ledger. It's just a way of keeping track of who has how much Bitcoin. Just the way that Wells Fargo is a ledger, Chase is a ledger, they just keep track of who has how many assets in their account. Well, Bitcoin does that, but instead of being controlled by a central authority or a bank or a government, Bitcoin isn't controlled by anybody. It's maintained by the network of computers around the world that are all running the Bitcoin software, processing transactions, and securing the network. And instead of a bank or a third-party middleman helping to produce transactions and update that ledger, well, the Bitcoin network provides a peer-to-peer way to do that instead. And most importantly, in addition to being censorship-proof, seizure-proof, Bitcoin is also inflation-proof because it is algorithmically designed for perfect scarcity. The creators of Bitcoin knew when they first started the network that if they were just to create all the Bitcoin in existence and give it away to a handful of people right there at the beginning, that wouldn't be such a good idea. And so what they did is they said, look, anybody willing to do work for the Bitcoin network will be paid with new Bitcoin. And every 10 minutes, we're going to release a new batch of them. And we're going to start with 50, and then we'll work our way down. Every 4 years, we're going to cut that in half. So every 10 minutes, 50, and then 4 years later, 25, and then 12 and a half, 6 and a quarter, and so on. And if you just happen to do the math on dividing that every 4 years, it turns out that around 2140, the very last Bitcoin will be mined, and there will be no more, no less than exactly 21 million. And so when you look at, going back to the monetary ideals we talked about earlier, when you look at the qualities of these monies, of gold, of fiat, of crypto, Bitcoin specifically, not all cryptocurrencies, but just Bitcoin. Bitcoin isn't just a little bit better, it's an order of magnitude better in every area that you want it to be better in. In particular, the one area of low trait, whether it's sovereign or government issued, because I don't know if the last couple hundred years have been enough evidence for y'all, but for me, it's been an absolute train wreck, and I'm certainly ready to opt out of that game. So to summarize the first half of this presentation, money's a technology created by humans that solve a very particular set of economic problems. And the better that money gets at conforming to these specific ideals, the better it actually serves to store value. And we've talked about how value storage is not the same as a price. And when people talk about, well, Bitcoin is $20,000 one day and it's $3,000 the next, how can it be a good store of value? Well, the exchange rate, the price, is simply what someone's willing to trade you for that asset, and that can change at any time. But value storage in a system is a function of scarcity, and it's a function of how and how much, if any, the total supply of that asset increases. So if you bought one Bitcoin 3 years ago, its price might have been different from today. But when you bought that one Bitcoin, you had one Bitcoin out of a total of 21 million. And the next year, you still had one out of 21 million. Today, you'll have one out of 21 million. Next year, no matter what the price is, one out of 21 million. There's no inflation. There's nobody siphoning away your purchasing power. Your percentage of the Bitcoin network stays exactly where it is. And so whenever you trade for that certain amount of Bitcoin, you're trading for a percentage of the Bitcoin network. That never changes. That's value storage. Now, price. Well, I think that the price is going to continue increasing dramatically, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. I think that, as I've just shown, and again, don't take my word for it. Go to my website, numeris.capital, read my Medium article, The Cryptocurrency Revolution in Financial Capital. Look at all the research I've done here and make up your own mind. But I'm going to give you my prediction for the future based on what I think the last 10 years of Bitcoin activity shows, and that what we're seeing is people realizing this in real time. People are realizing that Bitcoin is the best money humanity's ever seen, and they're doing it in a rapidly increasing fashion. What we're looking at here is called the bell curve of adoption. Anyone who's taken Marketing 101 has probably seen this image. It describes how populations adopt technology over time. And as it turns out, not everyone is going to adopt a new technology right away, or even at the same time. You're going to have a handful of people that invent the new tech, a slightly larger number of people that are willing to try it out first, and it's only then that the majority of the population gets involved. You can think of Steve Jobs inventing the iPhone, the handful of people willing to wait outside the Apple store for 3 days in the cold and the rain to get their hands on the very first one, even if it's full of bugs. The early majority might have been the folks that upgraded their CrackBerry after a few years, and then the laggards are when your grandmother gets an iPhone this December in 2019. Well, what's kind of nifty is if you sum the areas under that curve over time, you end up with this yellow curve. It's called the S curve of adoption. It looks like an S. And what we see is that even though adoption takes place slowly at first, it hits a tipping point, and then eventually it gets exponential. What's really interesting is that every major technology of the last century or so has all been adopted according to this S curve. And what's even more interesting than that is that the curves have been getting steeper. You look at the technologies in the last century or the last decade or so, no one had a cell phone in 1990. But by 2000, 20, 30% might have had a cell phone. And by 2010, everyone had a cell phone. And when you think about how cell phones and the internet and computers have enabled us to share information faster than ever to every last corner of the planet, you can see how an idea like Bitcoin might spread like wildfire. And a lot of people would say, well, I disagree with you, because here's the all-time price chart of Bitcoin. And when I ask people what that looked like, the answer is inevitably, well, it was obviously a bubble, and it obviously just popped. Although the last little bit on the right this year might give you a bit of pause as to exactly how much of a pop that was. But generally, it looks like everybody got really excited about Bitcoin in 2017, and then just as quickly, they got unexcited and have just left it for dead. Well, when I first saw this image, well, it was a couple of years ago, but when I saw something very similar, the first thing that came to my mind wasn't necessarily a bubble, but it was this chart, a chart that looks very similar. It's called the hype cycle chart. It was created by a technology consulting company called Gartner to describe the visibility of new technologies over time. And it turns out that humans are not great at long-term thinking, and we're also not great at nuanced shades of gray type of thinking. We like black and white, and we like our black and white right now. And so what generally happens when people hear about a new technology is they get super excited right away. And then when it turns out that, well, the technology might be a little raw, it doesn't cure cancer overnight, it might take a little bit of work, they lose interest just as quickly. But over time, we improve the UI, the UX, we soften those rough edges, the technology matures, it draws more interest, people create more of an ecosystem surrounding it. And maybe it doesn't ever get to the point where it cures cancer overnight, but it certainly matures enough to provide some sort of value to society. And so what I see when I look at a chart like this is the same thing. I see people discovering a new technology, getting way too excited about it way too quickly, and then just as quickly getting unexcited. But what's even more fascinating, I think, is that when you look at the Bitcoin chart in linear terms, you have to stretch the chart from $0 at the bottom to about $20,000 at the top, which is almost the maximum Bitcoin achieved back in 2017. And when you look at a chart that has to go from 0 to 20,000, it's going to be pretty compressed. And so it doesn't look like much happened before 2017. Maybe there was a little flurry of activity in 2014. There's a blip in 2013, and you really can't even see it on this chart, but there's something going on here mid-2011. But when we zoom in, what we find is a fractal of this same hype cycle example. If I zoom into that red circle, well, the one before it, again, it looks like a bubble just popped. Price jumps an order of magnitude, crashes. Well, if we zoom into 2014, we find the same thing. Price jumped from about $200 to $1,200 and then lost 80% of its value. But if we zoom in before that to 2013, we find another hype cycle. Price jumped from about $20 to $220 and then crashed. And if we zoom in even further to that little blip that you couldn't even see on the all-time chart, we find the biggest hype cycle of them all, where Bitcoin went from about $2 to $35 and then it died. Oh, wait, no, it didn't die. It turned around and jumped an order of magnitude. Then it died. Wait, no. It jumped an order of magnitude and then, wait, no. Now it's dead. 2019, I'm sorry, I got it all wrong. Now Bitcoin's dead. No, I think what's happening is that each one of these hype cycles represents the segments of society, like we talked about with that bell curve of adoption. Certain chunks of society are getting interested in Bitcoin at certain times, just like they do with every technology. There are some people that are going to want it at the very beginning, and there are some people that aren't going to want it until everyone that they know has it. And I think what happens is that these people play the typical crowd response type of game, because humans are herd creatures and they generally jump on bandwagons and then they jump off. And so what happens is, as every segment of society is finding Bitcoin and realizing the fundamental value it's created, they're undergoing one of these cycles. And I think the reason that that happens is because of Bitcoin's perfectly inelastic scarcity. Because in a typical commodities market, supply can react to demand. If I run a copper mining facility and the price of copper doubles in a week, I can hire more workers, I can buy more equipment, I can excavate more copper, I can produce more supply. And that increase in supply, in a reaction to perhaps an increase in demand, will then push the price back down, and you reach this sort of typical equilibrium point, like you might see in your Econ 101. Well, with Bitcoin, no matter how much people want it, no matter what the demand for Bitcoin is, the supply is never going to react. Certain amount of Bitcoin every 10 minutes, like clockwork, cut in half every 4 years, like clockwork, ending at 21 million, exactly. There's no reaction by supply to demand. And so what happens is sort of this runaway feedback loop, where a little bit of demand can push the price higher. And when the price goes higher, it gets a lot of media attention. Bitcoin up 300% in 2019. Well then, a lot of people start paying attention to it. People like to buy what's going up, they like to sell what's going down. You're supposed to do the opposite to make money, but people aren't really great at that. And so when they see the price of something going up, they get the fear of missing out. They go, oh man, Bitcoin's up 300%, I better get a piece of that. And so then that fear of missing out increases the demand, the price goes higher, more media attention, and it snowballs. Until, given that chunk of society, given that segment of the curve, the number of people who are susceptible to the idea of Bitcoin at that time, eventually, organically, you're just going to run out of buyers. And when you run out of buyers, the same process happens, but in reverse. A couple of people that bought at the bottom start taking profit. That's going to lower the price. When they take profit, stop losses are hit. The people that bought the very top, they start panic selling just as quickly. That lowers the price. That gets media attention. Bitcoin's crashing, Bitcoin's dying. More selling, lower price, more profit taking, more stop losses, more panic selling, and what goes up comes right back down. But every time that happens, a certain number of people realize the difference between price and value storage. And they realize that no matter what the price of Bitcoin is, whatever amount of Bitcoin they trade for, whatever percentage of the network they own, they're going to own that percentage for as long as they have that, and it's not going to change. And so if we look at Bitcoin not in linear terms, but in log, when we look at the change in percentage difference, we don't see a bubble that just popped. This is the same chart, the exact same chart. This is linear, and this is in log. And when we look at this, we see a chart that is about as up and to the right as it gets. And that's because Bitcoin is a fundamental improvement in money. We're experiencing something that we haven't experienced in thousands of years since humans first realized that that shiny piece of metal in the ground was better than the shark's teeth and the bird's feathers that they had been using. Bitcoin is the best money that we've ever seen. And it's not come a day too late because our world, economic clown world filled with trillions of dollars of negatively yielding bonds and presidents that tweeted the Fed to get interest rates at zero, negative interest rates in Europe. People in Europe are paying banks to store their money. Blows my mind. Well, that's a lot of money that I believe is going to very quickly be finding Bitcoin. And if you want an official price prediction, I think the next stop, as we've gone from a cent to 10 cents to $1 to $10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000, where we are roughly today, well, find me in a year, and maybe we'll be right here at around $100,000 Bitcoin. Now, I'm being booed off the stage by the time police, so I'm going to end it here, but thank you all for coming, and I will be outside answering questions for as long as you'll want to ask them. Thank you very much.